Good evening and welcome to the City of Topeka Planning Commission meeting. We are a commission appointed by the mayor and city council to plan for the orderly growth and development of the community, to hold public hearings, and to make recommendations to the city council on planning items. Please note that the city council rules state that the public hearings for planning cases shall be conducted solely by the planning commission. No additional public hearings will be conducted by the city council. Tonight's cases are tentatively scheduled to be heard by the city council next month. Agendas may be found at topeka.org. For cases that require public hearings, the procedure will be as follows. First, the planning department staff will summarize the case. Next, we will hear from the applicant or their representative. Then we will receive public testimony. Public comments should be addressed solely to the chair and are limited to 4 minutes. Chris, please take roll.
Mr. Armstrong?
Here.
Mr. Freed?
Here.
Mr. Hall?
Here.
Ms. Jordan?
Here.
Mr. Kanar?
Here.
Ms. Lawson?
Here.
Ms. Messina?
Here.
Ms. Ringler?
Here.
And Mr. Warner.
Here.
We have 9 and a quorum.
Thank you very much. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from our July 16th, 2018 meeting. If everyone's had a moment to review those, are there any questions, comments, corrections? If not, I would take a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Chris?
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Abstain.
Mr. Kanar?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Abstain.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
And Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Motion passes 7-0 with 2 abstaining.
Thank you. Next is any declarations of conflict of interest or ex parte communications by members of the commission or staff.
I have a conflict I want to declare with respect to the first item. I live in the property owner's, one of his properties downtown.
Okay.
So I'm going to abstain.
Okay.
Participating. Do I need to step out during the discussion?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other declarations? Not necessarily a declaration of conflict of interest, but just for the record, my office is reviewing both of these projects for purposes of different historic preservation programs, but I'm not directly involved and there's no financial interest. So I consulted with Ms. Feeney and I'm going to proceed. So the first item is our hearing. So Commissioner Lawson will excuse you.
We'll come get you.
Okay.
Yeah, we won't forget you. Please don't go far. And then we will be hearing case Z1804 by Van Buren Street Development, and Ms. Driver will present.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. The applicants requested a rezoning from O&I 2, Office and Institutional District, to D1, Downtown District. The properties are located at 304 and 308 Southwest Van Buren Street, which is at the southeast corner of the intersection of Southwest 3rd and Southwest Van Buren. The rezoning is really intended because it will better facilitate the reuse and repurposing of the former St. Joseph's German Catholic School for 11 market rate 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, and then future, an undetermined at this time, future use of the old convent for potentially a commercial use. The applicant has requested the D1 zoning because it provides an added relief from the O&I 2 off-street parking requirement, as well as to facilitate a mixed-use residential and commercial building. The current zoning of O&I 2 and the proposed zoning of D1 do already permit residential uses on all floors of the building, subject to 18225. Properties have remained zoned O&I 2 Office and Institutional District since 1992. Prior to that, the property was zoned E Multiple Family Dwelling District. That zoning district allowed offices, institutional, nonprofits, religious organizations, and residential uses. The zoning and character of surrounding properties really contains a broad mix of land uses and zoning classifications. To the north, you have a parking lot that's used by St. Joseph's Church, as well as a adjoining truck parking lot. To the west, you have a utility substation. East is industrial, comprised of industrial uses. To the south is a parking lot that's associated with an automobile repair business on Jackson Street, and as well as residential along Van Buren. The intended purpose of the D1 downtown district is to encourage compatible mixed-use activity in downtown Topeka, as well as implement the city's comprehensive plan. D1 allows 100% building coverage, no minimum building setbacks, and has no required off-street parking requirement. The current parking requirement in ONI 2 is not conducive for purposing of the building without impacting its historic integrity. Additionally, there's underutilized cutback parking along Southwest Van Buren, as you can see. The applicant held a neighborhood information meeting, and there were 6 attendees at the meeting, and all of those attendees expressed support for the project. The proposed D1 zoning is compatible with the existing and desired future character of the neighborhood for mixed uses, taking into account this is a transitioning area that's moving from and shifting from industrial to mixed-use redevelopment. The buildings were constructed around 1912. They were used as a school until the 1970s. After that point, they were used for classes until around the year 2006, and to my knowledge have been vacant since that time. As the present buildings have remained vacant for at least 10 years or longer, the current zoning does not reflect the highest and best potential use of the property. The Land Use and Growth Management Plan designates the property for downtown mixed-use development. More specifically, the Ward Mead Neighborhood Plan indicates the property and buildings should be preserved and renovated. The proposed use better facilitates the conversion and reuse of the existing building and safeguards its protection as historic property. There is adequate parking along Van Buren. No detrimental effects are anticipated by the rezoning to D1 downtown district. Staff is recommending the approval of the rezoning. The applicants are here to take any questions that you may have as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Driver. Are there any questions for the staff and the commission at this point? We'll now like to open the public hearing. If the applicant or the applicant's representative would like to step forward and say anything.
Madam Chair, my name is Mark Bernheide with Van Buren Street Development, and I think Ms. Driver did a good job of explaining the project. The biggest reason we're doing it is because we're planning 11 residential lofts in the old school, and under the current zoning, it's my understanding we'd have to provide 2 parking places per unit, and about 6 to 7 of those units are going to be single bedroom units, so we don't need 2 parking places for those. So this gives us a little bit more flexibility on how we can approach that project. And as she mentioned, there's also plenty of parking along Van Buren Street, and the parking lot that we have on site will have 18 parking places. So, other than that, I'd be available for any questions.
Are there any questions for the applicant? Thank you.
Thank you.
If there's anyone else in the audience who'd like to address this item, now is the time. You may come forward.
Hi, my name is TJ Plumberg. I live at 324 Southwest Van Buren, just up the street from the school. They were talking about, and I'm not sure if this is the same person that has the school on Jackson, but they encased the parking lot with a fence. So I don't know whether Father would let them use the parking lot at their discretion, except for when school was going on, or church was going on. So there's plenty of parking. And I believe I understood you saying that they weren't gonna change the exterior. They were keeping it structurally,
That is correct.
and is it structurally sound now?
I would,
That would be a
I mean, they
question for
would-
the
they just-
one
applicant.
question you should direct to the applicant there. or
Well, I thought it
We can, we
direct
can,
to the applicant.
we can ask the applicant to address that.
Okay.
Okay.
I've lived there since 1990, and there's always been, it's a shortcut for a lot of people going to Let's Help or across to the Mission. So I guess the applicant needs to understand that these people don't bother anybody. That's just where they're walking. I've never had any trouble at all from anybody walking around there. So I feel it's a very safe neighborhood. I'm glad somebody is doing something with St. Joe. Because I was baptized, confirmed, and married at St. Joe Church. Probably be buried there. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak to this case? We can, I'd have the owner's representative come back if you'd like to address a couple of those questions. Specifically, there was a question about fencing, the exterior appearance of the buildings, and the structural integrity of the buildings, if you would like to
Sure,
address any
sure.
of those.
Yeah, structurally, the building's very sound. It's built, it's rock solid. The church did a great job of keeping the weather out. It's got a solid roof on it, good roof. Windows are all intact. I mean, really, considering the building's been vacant since the mid-'70s from a school perspective, I mean, it's very structural sound. They've done a great job of keeping it up. Fence-wise, we will have a fence on the parking lot that is right to the east of the school, with gates on it, just like we have it on Jackson Street, yes. But that's a lot that we own. So we won't be fencing the church parking lot across the street, no. Yeah. So. And, exterior, yes, it's a preservation project, so it will retain all of its architectural features. Really, besides a cleaning up, our goal is when you look at that building, it should look exactly like it does right now, except for cleaned up, new paint, and looking sharp. So it will maintain its integrity on the outside. And the Historic Society, we're doing a tax credit project, so they'll be reviewing all of our plans for the project. So we hope to retain a high level of architectural integrity on the project.
And you're aware that the D1 zoning has its own design guidelines for the
Yes.
downtown as well. Are there any other questions at this time for the applicant?
Thanks.
If there's no one else from the audience who'd like to address this case, I'm going to close the public hearing at this time. Any discussion by the commissioners? Thoughts?
Madam Chair, I have one question for staff. With 11 dwelling units and not knowing the age group that you're marketing to, would the ratio, it looks like it's like 1.6 spaces off-street per unit. You mentioned that there's underutilized public parking along the street. If part of that on-street parking is utilized for some of the tenants, if there are conceivably, there could be more than 2 cars, or more than 1 car per dwelling unit. I'm just wondering, and if they have future commercial use of the second building, if they would actually have enough parking for both uses. that's just the question I raised for consideration. I don't know how it underutilized amounts to in terms of additional parking on street that's available, so.
Let me jump in. And you can jump in if you need to. The parking right now that's underutilized, of course, is the on-street parking is along Van Buren. You know, that was there for the school back in the day. With the West Star substation taking up the entire block across the street from the school, we don't think this is going to be an issue. This is a downtown area, much like the applicant's current apartments, lofts down on Jackson Street, where you do have a mix of uses in that area. You have even less mix of uses here right now. We hope to see more, and when that project comes along, I don't think there'll be any issue with parking in the, certainly the immediate future. This is, and even the long-term future with half of the block being taken up by, really undevelopable as a substation. So that kind of sold us on the fact that parking is not going to be an issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the commissioners?
I guess just a comment, I go to the Y pretty often, and I saw the sold sign. I'm so glad to see that this is a use. I feel like it works well with the land use planning that we've been aiming at and the work that's been done on St. Joseph for the last couple of years. I think it just adds to the neighborhood.
Any other questions or comments or motions?
Madam Chair, I would move, based on the findings and analysis listed in the staff report, move to recommend the governing body approval of the reclassification of the subject property from O&I to office and institutional to D1 downtown district.
I would second.
It's been a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Chris, would you please take roll?
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Hogg?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Canar?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson is abstaining. Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
And Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Motion passes 8-0 with one abstaining.
Thank you. I'm gonna wait till Ms. Lawson is back in her seat. We will welcome back Ms. Lawson. We missed you. Thank you. All right, we are going to be ready now for application PUD 1802 by Pioneer Midtown Homes LLC. Mr. Nudaba?
Yes, Commissioners. Case PUD 1802 is an application submitted by Pioneer Midtown Homes LLC. The Pioneer Group have completed a number of residential infill projects within the city as well as elsewhere, some including reuse of historic buildings, such as being proposed here in the case of the Casson Building, located at the southwest corner of 6th Avenue and Topeka Boulevard. There are three areas, actually, that are contiguous. Area 1, which includes the Casson Building, is currently zoned Downtown District, D1. Area 2 is currently zoned C4 Commercial, while Area 3 is zoned O&I 2, Office and Institutional. All three areas together comprise just under an acre, 0.84 acres to be more precise. The Pioneer Midtown Homes PUD plan provides for renovation and reuse, again, of the Casson Building for 23 residential apartments, along with construction of a new building for 10 residential apartments fronting onto Southwest 6th Avenue, and a new building for 8 residential apartments fronting onto Southwest Tyler Street, with all 3 buildings having access to existing adjoined public alleyways. 2 parking lots provide 41 parking spaces for use by project residents. The Casson Building itself was originally constructed in 1927 as a 2-story building with commercial uses on the ground floor and residential apartments on the 2nd floor, while the 3rd and 4th stories were added in 1947, at which time the building was converted to an office and commercial use. A penthouse apartment was added atop the then 4-story building in 1956. The portion of the project site fronting onto Southwest 6th Avenue, Area B, currently includes a parking lot that for many years provided off-street parking for the Casson Building's various office, commercial, and residential uses. Area C, fronting onto Southwest Tyler Street, has remained vacant except for an existing public alleyway and private driveway, presumably in providing additional access and parking for the Casson Buildings and other adjacent properties. The Casson Building and adjacent multifamily residential building to the south are zoned D1 Downtown District again, while the property further south is zoned O&I 2 Office and Institutional, and includes a small 1-story office building. The east side of Southwest Topeka Boulevard is also within the D1 Downtown District and includes the First United Methodist Church. Area B, with the existing parking lot as well as adjacent properties to the west, are currently zoned C4 and include a multifamily residential structure. On the north side of Southwest 6th Avenue, there are several businesses, including Terry's Bar and Grill, a liquor store, and a vacant residential apartment building, all within the C4 district. Area C is currently within the O&I 2 Office and Institutional District, while the adjacent property to the south includes an existing single-family residence and a parking lot adjacent. Southwest Topeka Boulevard within the project area is categorized as a principal arterial, while 6th Avenue is a minor arterial and Southwest Tyler is a local street. All roadways currently include sidewalks adjacent to the project area. Existing public alleyways will provide cross-access to the parking lot areas and public streets and walkways. Additional traffic will be generated by the proposed development is not anticipated to be significant, and a traffic impact study is not being required by the city. The City of Topeka parking standards normally require 72 parking spaces for the proposed 41 residential apartments. As proposed, the 41 parking spaces are deemed sufficient due to the location of the project within a near downtown, mixed-use, and higher-intensity type neighborhood, where it is anticipated that some future residents will not own private vehicles and will instead utilize public transportation or other alternatives. The project developer will be providing a bus stop pad near the intersection of Topeka Boulevard and 6th Avenue, pursuant to placement and construction standards of the Topeka Metro Transit Authority. In addition to new off-street parking areas, there are approximately 5 existing cutback parking spaces on Southwest 6th Avenue adjacent to the Casson Building that will be retained. The new residential building within Area B of the project, running onto Southwest 6th Avenue, will include 10 one-bedroom units, 5 units at ground level and 5 units on the upper level, accessed via external stairways, with an overall building footprint of 3,123 square feet, comprising approximately 16% of the site. The new residential building within Area C, fronting onto Southwest Tyler, will include 8 one-bedroom units, 4 units at ground level, 4 units on the upper level, accessed again via external stairways. The building footprint of 2,488 feet, comprising 17% of the site. The Casson Building itself, having recently been approved for inclusion on the Register of Historic Kansas Places, will be subject to historic design requirements during the rehabilitation and reuse of the building. Mr. Rick Creedy actually also provided us with a picture of the building taken in approximately 1950. Shows a couple of tenants there, International Business Machines, and of course, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as indicated by the rooftop sign. The new buildings, the two new residential buildings will be constructed in conformance to these building elevations, as noted on the PUD master plan. During the pre-application process, the applicant and staff did confer on these designs, and everyone is in agreement that it would fit into the character of the neighborhood as it is, including setbacks, which will be approximately the same as the existing development with the parking areas to the rear of the buildings, which is always desirable, especially in a near downtown area such as this. In regard to signage, the PUD master plan provides for 2 monument signs as well as 1 wall sign on each of the 2 new buildings. Signs for the Casson building will be permitted in accordance with the downtown district's sign standards, which is appropriate for an historic building in a near downtown location. The applicant did conduct a neighborhood information meeting on the 25th of August, the 25th of July, with attendees including Councilmember Karen Hiller. Subjects discussed included types of units, including monthly rents, available parking, stormwater management, and general history of the building and property. In regard to character of the neighborhood, staff have concluded that the proposed PUD master plan is indeed compatible with existing and desired future character of the neighborhood, which includes a mix of uses, including residential, commercial, and office. The rehabilitation and reuse of the currently vacant Casson building in accordance with historic standards and guidelines, along with new infill construction, will likely have a very positive impact upon future development and redevelopment within the neighborhood. The proposed 2-story apartment buildings will provide an appropriate transition from commercial buildings on Topeka Boulevard and 6th Avenue to the residential buildings and land use to the west and southwest. In regard to the project's conformance to the comprehensive plan, the Topeka Land Use and Growth Management Plan 2040 includes the subject properties within a mixed-use node, as are generally located in and around major street intersections. Subject properties are also included within the Old Town Neighborhood Plan as downtown, in recognition again of the mixed-use nature and higher intensity of the area between Tyler Street and Topeka Boulevard. The proposed PUD amendment is indeed in conformance with both the Topeka Land Use Growth Management Plan as well as the Old Town Neighborhood Plan. Based upon the findings and analysis detailed in the staff report, planning staff do recommend approval of the PUD master plan subject to indicated conditions. And this does conclude staff's presentation, and we're certainly available to answer questions.
Are there any questions for the staff at this point?
I have a question. So on the parking thing, so as I understand it, currently, the standards are already kind of accounting for, there's not necessarily going to be 2 vehicles per unit, right? That's how we got to the 72 spaces for 41 units, because after 20, it drops down.
That's correct.
So although the current plan takes for that, you're calling for a significant variance from that for this project. Is that correct then?
Yes, there are less than normally would be required. Another factor that I didn't specifically mention is that all of these units will be 1-bedroom units, which also factored into that as well, except for one of the units, which will be 2-bedroom unit. But that's the one atop the building, Casson building currently, the 2-bedroom unit. But everything, all the others will be 1-bedroom units.
So 40 of the 41 units are single-bedroom units?
Yes, that's correct.
Are there any other questions at this point? I would open the public hearing at this point if the owner or the owner's representative would like to approach.
Yeah, good evening, Commissioners. Mark Boyd with SBB Engineering, here representing the owner, Pioneer Midtown Homes. Rick Creedy is also with me with Pioneer Group. If you have any questions outside the structure or the grounds themselves. Might note, I don't really have anything to add to the summary report. I will note that on that elevation, if you could bring that back up again. For those of you that were paying real close attention, the directions were mixed up. I think this was a really early version of the elevations. Just want to make clear that the north side of that 10-plex building facing 6th Street and Tyler, for that matter, are the doors and the entries. The back walls, which have all our windows, face the parking lots. So we've got our north and our south turned around. Just for clarification. Okay. We'll update that.
Yeah.
It got updated once, you just grabbed it.
Are there any questions for the applicant at this point? All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
As part of the public hearing, we would like anyone else who would like to speak to this case to come forward, if there is anyone. All right, not seeing anybody, I will go ahead and close the public hearing at this point. Any discussion amongst the commissioners? Questions, comments?
Madam Chair, I guess I do have a question. I see on here, and I could be wrong, only one bicycle rack. Is that, am I missing?
So one at the back,
So there's,
one per building, is that right?
Yes, Commissioner, that's correct. One per building.
Do you see those two now?
okay. And the requirements state just a rack per building? Is that, you'll have to remind me on the requirements.
The requirement in our code is 5% of the required parking is to be bicycle parking. There are 2 spaces per rack, so I believe this exceeds that.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Discussion points? I, of course, am pleased to see the historic building being reused. That's amazing. The infill, in my opinion, is, like you said, the setback and everything is the main thing, the massing, size, scale. That's what I always look for in infill. It seems to meet that. If there's no further discussion, I would entertain a motion. If anyone has one.
I would make a motion. Based on the findings and analysis in the staff report, I would move to recommend to the governing body approval of the PUD master plan along with all of the recommendations and conditions.
I second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All right, hearing none. Chris?
Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Ms. Ringler.
Aye.
Ms. Messina.
Aye.
Ms. Lawson.
Aye.
Mr. Kennard.
Aye.
Ms. Jordan.
Aye.
Mr. Hall.
Aye.
Mr. Freeman.
Aye.
Mr. Armstrong.
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
Thank you. That concludes the public hearing portion of our agenda. Next up is discussion items, and first up is the building design standards.
Madam Chair, we'll switch some chairs here and bring up Dan Warner, our comprehensive planning manager, to lead the discussion on this, as he has led the whole way.
Oh, look at
It's
that.
official now.
Quick change.
All right, commissioners. So obviously not the first time we've talked about non-residential design with the Planning Commission. Nevertheless, it's going to be a comprehensive presentation because we do plan to come back in September for a possible action on this item. Just want to make sure we cover everything. So we're talking about non-residential design review. This is building design for commercial buildings. This particular example on the screen is not meant to compare that building smack in the middle with the Tudor house to its side. The standards are not dictating style, so it's not that that building doesn't match that Tudor house. It is supposed to take into consideration context, but what the biggest issue with this particular building is its lack of windows and doors that face the street. That is one of the main kind of considerations in the design standards. This next example is a new building downtown. This is at 5th and Van Buren. You get some sense of the context of that location by looking at the buildings on the right side of the picture. It's primarily multi-story office buildings in this area. So the issue here with this building, it's one story, but really it's the lack of windows and doors facing the street, facing Van Buren. We do have some windows on 5th Street, but they're not really in proportion with the building or with the context. So we've got a lot of good things going on downtown these days, and this building doesn't really help that out very much. So a little bit about process. So staff spent the last couple of years practicing with the design standards that you have in front of you tonight, just to see how they work, see how projects that are coming in, how they work or did not work. Planning Commission actually kicked this process off on November 17th. You probably remember we had an online visual assessment survey that was out for a month and was issued in January of this year. And we have a technical review committee that we put together with local architects. Commissioner Werner was on that committee with us. We met first in December and then a few times through June, and that committee really did make a lot of changes to the draft and improved it. And most recently we had a development forum in July, the end of July. We have a very robust list of people that that are in the development professions that we invited to a meeting. It was very well attended forum. A lot of people came to that, and we presented the design standards at that meeting, and now we're here tonight with the discussion on them. So real quick on the survey, we asked people to assess the visual appeal of buildings. You might remember we asked them to rate 12 images. The results are presented in two different ways. There's a bar chart that kind of shows a bell curve on how people voted, and the raw numbers are presented above the pictures as well. So this particular example was rated somewhat appealing or very appealing. That was the highest ratings on that one. Again, just as a refresher, we asked people to rate if the building was very unappealing, somewhat unappealing, neutral, somewhat appealing, or very appealing. 1,062 people took the survey, which was incredible. Even more impressive in my mind is the 480 that provided written comments. That's about almost 50% bothered to take the time to actually write some comments. This was the last question of the building design survey, was how important is building design to the visual appeal of the community, and 96% rated it very important or somewhat important. And then the second to last question on the survey, the building design survey, what two factors are most important to the visual appeal of buildings? And it was architectural details and landscaping. This is interesting. Landscaping, this is the first time that was prompted in the survey. That did not come up anywhere else previous to that slide. So that it got rated second was pretty interesting. And then also, I mentioned the 480 comments that we got, many comments about landscaping either being good or bad or whatever. So we kind of improved our design standards by including some landscaping ideas, and then Mike is going to talk to you about some landscaping changes that we're proposing, and that really is kind of coming out of the input we got on landscaping being important. So we're talking about non-residential design, so we're requiring building elevations that detail materials, architectural details, windows, doors, four-sided design. So why are we doing this? We don't have currently citywide design review. If we want to apply some sort of design review to projects through a zoning process, for instance, we have the PUD process that we can use, but even then we don't really have real good specific guidance as to what standards to use to review those projects. We did recently, within the last year or so, converted our downtown zoning from C5 to D1, and the D1 has codified design guidelines, and we also have historic districts downtown. So we're doing design review downtown, but nowhere else in Topeka. We have a policy basis in our LUGMUP. There's policies in our land use plan about design. And then we're partnering with a sign code update. Mike has talked to you a few times about the sign code changes, so we're calling that a visual codes update. So through that 2 years or so of practice, we discovered really most of the projects we get don't really need design review. Most of them are pretty good. The issue is really the few that come in that aren't very well designed, and that's kind of the impetus of the design standards, is to improve those projects. So we're going to talk about the draft here. So there are two documents in your packet. The first one is the building design standards. The other one is some examples. We're not going to go over the examples. We're going to go over the standards. So we're going to talk about applicability, alternate compliance, design review standards, and appeal. And I'll kind of call out the page numbers as I go through some of these slides. So page 1 of your of the standards, page 106, is applicability. So the design standards will apply to new construction or alteration whose floor area is greater or less than 50%. And then any project requiring a building permit that's proposing to remodel at least 50% of its front and or street facade. Front and street facade is underlined because that is kind of one of the keys to the design standards. The standards are always greater for fronts and streets, sides of buildings. The standards are organized by building type, so there are 3 building types, A, B, and C. The building types are based on zoning district. So A is in our O&I districts, C1, C2, MS, X3, and the D districts downtown. B is C3, C4, U1, and X1. C4 is our most, that's the zoning district we have the most of. So most of the projects are going to be Bs that we review. And then C is our industrial districts. So again, so the standards are higher for A, kind of in the middle for B, and the least for C. So we still have design review in our industrial districts, just not quite the same standards. So this is on page 2. This particular undue hardship used to be in our appeals section. We moved it to applicability. It didn't make a lot of sense in the appeals section. So basically, the planning director can exempt out design review based on an undue hardship. So there are a few items that are listed that might qualify a project for having undue hardship due to design review. And so if that determination is made, then that project does not have to get reviewed, basically. The next section is alternate compliance. It's on the bottom of page 2. So we're dealing with design standards here. These aren't typically very flexible. We're trying to build, compared to design guidelines, for instance, we're trying to build a little flexibility into the process by offering alternative compliance. So if a project can't meet all of its design standards, there's a way to still get there by including some alternate compliance items. So there's a list of them at the bottom of page 2. Those are a lot of kind of site planning type improvements. So these are really building design standards, but these alternate compliance are some items that can improve the site. And these are where the landscaping ideas came in. And also, if a project is lacking windows and doors, it can have more architectural details as a way to comply overall. So a little section here that allows staff to work with applicants a little more than maybe typical with design standards. And then this is on page 3. It's G and H on page 3. This is moved also, it used to be an applicability, but basically certain locations will have a higher design consideration or lower, kind of depending on where they are. So for instance, a building downtown will have to meet its, if it's a B, it'll have to meet its B standard, but also add something from alternative compliance to kind of improve the situation a little more. So that might be required for a downtown location or something on a major road or next to residential. If a commercial building is located in an industrial district, it can maybe go down to a C building type, but it would have to add something like alternative compliance to improve the design. So it can go down in building type, but still have to have an alternative compliance to ultimately get approved. So the next section here is the design standards. So this is basically 4 and 5, the tables in your draft. So the 3 major design elements here are building materials, architectural details, and windows and doors. And I'll kind of go over those by talking about each building type. So a type A building for building materials has to have 85% stone, brick, etc. And the etc. is the list that's on the top of page 4. So there's a number of items there that can be included, but it has to be 85% for a type A building. And then for a type B, it's 60%, and C is a little different. It's different materials and a different calculation. So B is 60%, A is 85%. So for a type B building, it has to have 3 architectural details. So this example that's provided here, the modulating facade is one, the varied roof line is another, and the awnings above the windows are the third. So that's 3 architectural details on this example for a type B building. A type A building has to have 4 details. So if this was 4, if this was a type A building, which actually is, I think you could argue the horizontal details that are on that facade could be the fourth detail, the different soldier courses of brick and whatnot. So, and then type C has to have 2 architectural details. So A is 4, B is 3, C is 2. And so for windows and doors, a type C building has to have 25% of the front facade as windows or doors, not including garage doors. A type A building would have to have 50% and a type B 40%. This is just for front facades. We have a separate percentage. It's lower for street facades. So if a front is not on a street, then the street has to have some windows as well. A couple other design standards in the draft that are worth mentioning. First one is non-street or non-front-facing walls. So basically, long expanses of walls have to include architectural details. So there's a length standard in there that dictates how many details. And then finally is a mechanical system. So roof-mounted mechanical systems screening is required. So this is definitely a new idea. here. The standard was, this is one that definitely got some revision during the committee process, so there might be some situations where the grade of the properties make screening impractical, and also the screening has to incorporate the, fit into the design of the building, basically, not just be kind of slapped up there. The last thing is appeals. So this comes basically from our NCD. If the planning director determines that the plans are not in conformance, that decision is appealed to the BZA, the Board of Zoning Appeals. So next steps, September 17th, we'll come back with a public hearing, and then governing body, if we keep going in October, November. There's a web address for the information. You could probably just Google Topeka Visual Code Update and take you right to that link. Is any questions on building design?
I have a question. And it just occurred to me on the case before, the PUD case on the apartments, and I know those are residential. But as downtown continues to develop, redevelop, and we have infill projects, is there going to be a safeguard for the design, for instance, right on Kansas Avenue, if there's going to be a residential project that is proposed? And is it under the D1 or the D design guidelines? Or is there going to be a whole nother set of residential guidelines?
Well, that's a good question. So
I just thought if I've been on this committee for a year, but
Well, I thought of that too, because I mean, that vinyl siding is not my cup of tea.
yeah, exactly.
100% of the building.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's,
I mean,
right.
I would have
That-
preferred something to break that up.
That
but I don't know that we can.
elevation would have required, probably would have required 3 or 4 of the elements. So but it's not in this category. So
it's possible that D1 will help if we're downtown for the residential buildings. Our historic districts will definitely help in that regard if they're in those districts. But otherwise, yeah, we don't really have anything else for residential currently.
So I guess a follow-up question is, when it's a residential use, but it's a commercial purpose, like an apartment building, we're viewing those as residential properties, though.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that in the committee, and I think the difference between those residential uses, the designs are they're just not, they don't transfer very well between commercial and residential.
Yeah, and if I may, I just echo what Mr. Warner just said. These particular guidelines don't lend itself well to residential. Some of them do, like materials might, but windows or openings don't really. And so architectural elements, I think we would have to recraft some of this so they can apply a little better to multiple family developments. So commercial from a building code standpoint, but a residential land use. I think that's where we kind of drew the line for now. And I was going to make that comment, kind of leaving the door open, but that's with your direction. It would take a little more or a lot more to factor residential land use / commercial building code buildings into the guidelines. So that we'd have to go back and revamp this a lot. And that's certainly one of the things we did not, in the visual survey, we did not show any residential. So that wasn't the intent going forward. It was more, what do we need to do? Let's get a solid foundation. Let's get a practice going, a design culture going for the commercial side. And I think we come back with a 2.0 version that can address residential. it's a little harder to gauge, and I would like to get the community's input a little more before jumping into that. But we are definitely open to it.
I think it's a good goal. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
This is a great start, and Mr. Warner has put a lot of time and effort into this, and I really appreciate all that. And I know he's worked hard on it over the last year, but it's a really good start, and look forward to implementing it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to,
Moving on. So this is a much less ambitious project than what Dan has just shared with you. This is really nibbling around the edges of something that's an existing set of standards. We have a landscaping ordinance, and we also have standards for screening for certain types of uses. Our current landscaping ordinance is designed based on a point system. I would say it's not particularly prescriptive, but it has a formula that generates a certain number of points, and that certain number of points will dictate how much landscaping goes on a site. The points are generated by the size of the development or the size of the development site, the number of parking spaces, and other factors such as preservation of existing trees and use of an automatic irrigation system and stormwater detention, best management practices, that type of thing. So that will generate a certain number of points, and then the landscape designer will produce a landscape plan that will reach that number of points through use of certain types of landscaping. So there are some plants that generate 1 point, like a shrub that's worth 1 point. An evergreen tree is worth 8 points. An understory tree is worth 5 points. And a large canopy tree is worth 11 points. So you can get to the number of points faster by using larger landscaping. Therein is the incentive. It's not prescriptive. It's designed to let the landscape designer exercise some creativity and adjust for certain conditions and preferences. So we don't wish to depart from that a lot. We have looked at other landscape codes that do tend to be fairly prescriptive. They'll say how many trees should be in front of a site, what's the density of trees, how many trees per 50 feet or 100 feet, lineal feet, that type of thing. And we kind of stayed away from that. So with that, I'll explain the screening at the end of this. So it's pretty hard to read the slide, but this is just a summary of what is in your packet. There's a sheet in your packet. And I can't really read it myself very well, but first is to increase the overall quantity of required landscaping for new development for all zoning districts with the exception of our 2I industrial districts and the X2 and X3 districts. Increase the quantity by 20%. Establish a minimum standard for landscaping along street frontages. So that's the distance between the parking lot, if there's a parking lot, and the front property line. Revise the required landscape setback along street rights of way. I just had that mixed up. So there's a goal in the landscape ordinance currently that says that landscape plans shall emphasize plantings along street frontages, but doesn't really say much more than that. One of the proposals here is to specify what that means. How does that translate into quantity? And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. And then the fourth issue is on newer lots that have been platted since 2002, June 11th, 2002, the required landscape setback along street rights of way is 20 feet. And this is an opportunity to provide an incentive for people or developers, owners, to place their buildings closer to the street, have it a little bit more pedestrian oriented, and de-emphasize the building and the entrance to the building instead of emphasizing the parking lot. It's for aesthetic purposes, primarily. So I have a series of photos, just to get started. So this is, there's little or no landscaping on this site. Again, little or no landscaping on that site. Decent landscaping. This is after our current landscape ordinance was adopted. It's on Wanamaker compared to, well, the previous slide. That one predates our landscape ordinance. That's not the one I was looking for, but this has some landscaping, but not very much. This has not bad, but there's not a lot of landscaping, and there's really no large plants along Gage. This is at Gage and 12th. This is a newer development. It's better, but there are a few shrubs, and there aren't very many medium or large trees. And this is Herman's, recently developed. This is a pretty good landscape plan. And the landscape setback for this, I believe, is 7 feet behind the property line. Keep in mind, most of you probably know this already, but the property line, the front property line is behind the sidewalk. It's typically between 1 and 2 feet behind the sidewalk. So that area between the sidewalk and the curb is public right-of-way. So when I say a landscape setback, that's measured from the property line. This is a project that's on Wanamaker. It's been there for several years. The landscaping is starting to mature. It's a pretty nice landscape plan, abundant landscaping with a substantial setback. That's the site. That's an aerial photo of the site. So picture, if you would, with an incentive to have the building closer to the street, potentially you could have this building set back 10 feet from the front property line. Again, we now have design standards for buildings, so that would help ensure that the building is more attractive. You have a more attractive building, and you want to bring that up closer to the street. It performs kind of a street wall, if you want to call it that. That's a more attractive, more pedestrian-oriented environment. Psychologically, some people will say it slows down traffic too, because there's uses and buildings closer to the street. And then the parking would be on the side and rear. So this is an example of abundant landscaping. This is a tire shop, a different city with abundant landscaping. So go back to, let's go back to this. This is a pretty good example. So this was a redevelopment site. It's a large site. Because they were redeveloping a site, they did not have to put in all of the landscaping that's normally required. If this was a green site, vacant site, they would have to put in 100% of the landscaping. But we did have them maintain a landscape setback of 4 feet. In this case, that's 4 feet from the property line, and it actually equates to about 6 or 7 feet. So that's a 6 or 7 foot landscape setback behind the sidewalk, but a 4 foot setback behind the property line. So what the changes would do is require that most of the required landscaping points be emphasized along the front. In the case of a single or a site with one street frontage, that would be 50% of the landscape points would be along the front, along the street. If in the case of a site with 2 street frontages, it would be 60%. And in the case of a site with 3 street frontages, it would be 70%. Yes, sir.
And I'm sorry, because I'm obviously so when we talk about a building setback of 20 feet, that means it can't be closer than 20 feet to the street.
Correct. To the property line at the right, the right of way, street right of way.
So when we talk about landscaping setback, we don't count between the curb and the sidewalk, right?
Correct.
So when you say it's a 7-foot setback, does that start from the sidewalk closest to the curb or the back side of the sidewalk? And then does that mean it fits within that setback area, or it has to start 7 feet behind that?
So the way it would work, I looked for a good site plan to show you and how this would work. I didn't really find one that would demonstrate it very well, so I apologize for that. But picture, if you will, if you look at that site, you see the street in the foreground, the curb, then the grass strip between the curb and the sidewalk, which often contains utilities, not always. So there are some limitations to landscaping in that area. Then you have the sidewalk, and then typically the property line is 1 to 2 feet behind the sidewalk. So the setback would start at that point. So let's say, and this is probably what you're going to find in most cases. Again, these are on sites that are platted prior to 2002. What you're going to find in most cases is the property line is 1 to 2 feet behind the sidewalk. So with a 6-foot setback, you'd have 6 feet in addition to that. So you might have 7 feet or 8 feet. The reason why that 6 feet is important is if you look at what type of surface will support a healthy tree, allow that tree to grow and have a healthy crown on it, and have a healthy root system, typically that's going to be 6 feet. It's better to have more, but also you lose something if you have more. First of all, you're eating up a lot more land, which is difficult on some of these smaller, older sites. And it's not necessarily the aesthetic environment you're always looking for in a city like Topeka. What you'll find in newer suburban communities, they might have a landscape setback of 20 feet or 15 feet along all the retail arterials.
Thank you.
So I think that covers it. Are there any questions about the landscaping?
I do have one. I just wanted to make sure that I understood you correctly, and combining our building design discussion with our landscaping discussion. We're wanting to end up with shorter setbacks because we're going to have more attractive new buildings. When we're talking about the landscaping, you're going to require half of the landscaping points to be on what is presumably the most attractive side of the building that we're trying to get closer to the street, and not on the sides. I'm just not sure in all road configurations and whatnot, looking at what's the front, what's the side, whether the front side actually needs the majority of the points.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to envision everything, but I just...
So Commissioner Carnar, if I could, we tested this idea on a number of different sites,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the nice looking site plans we've gotten already meet these standards. It is kind of difficult to get it exact, but there is a lot of discretion that can be exercised in the implementation of the landscape standards. We even have a provision in the landscape plan that grants the planning director the authority to approve an alternative landscape plan. So if something just doesn't work, we can do that. There are exceptional cases. For example, if you have a really large site, like an industrial site, that's going to generate a lot of points. To require someone to meet all the landscape requirements based on the size of the site is sometimes just unreasonable and doesn't really do much for in the public interest. The public doesn't gain that much for it. So there is a lot of flexibility there. If you look at some of these sites, in my research on this, if you're trying to get trees along the front, this gives us a little more teeth to say, no, you need to put some trees along the front. If there's a lot of retail developments, not all of them, but some of them, they do not want to put trees along their frontage. Because, well, the consultant will propose a plan and their owner's telling them, I don't want trees hiding my sign, I don't want trees hiding my business.
Mm-hmm.
Understood. If there there was a desire by the owner to landscape their site, we wouldn't need to have a landscape ordinance, because they'd just do it. So it's really a balance. But in order to really have some teeth to say, you need to have more landscape along the frontage, we needed something other than just landscaping shall be emphasized along frontages.
Thank you.
Commissioner Carr, I just want to make sure, were you intimating at the landscaping kind of competing with the new, well-designed building now? Were you?
That is exactly, there might be instances where you actually wanted more and I don't know the balancing.
Right.
And I think what I was taking from Mr. Hall's answer that was most important was the level of discretion that staff's going to have. If you have a building that, you'd want emphasized, you'd have the freedom to move around. But I thought that seemed kind of perhaps counterintuitive that we're mandating so much on the design standards for a building on the street front, on its main street front, and then saying, and now throw all your landscaping right in front of this beautiful building that you've just spent all the money on those design features.
That's a very good point, and one that as Mr. Hall indicated, we try to balance. I think when you see the pictures, when you look at the survey, what we notice the most is even with the well-designed building, it always improved when you had more green. Whether that was now competing with the design of the building or complementing the design of the building, I think that's the trick, or that's the sweet spot where we want to be, is we want to complement that well-designed building. So and not hide it. I don't think that's not the intent at all. I think the tough job that Mike has, that I recognize it from this side, is the arm wrestling that goes back and forth. Emphasize street frontage. What does that mean? How much does that mean? So we didn't want to go too high with the percentage of points. We just wanted a base to start from. And if we can start from there and not be too high to begin with, we'll just go from there. And I think, although he doesn't show you tonight, he did a lot of testing of this, and we found a lot of people are clearly in compliance along their street frontages, but not everybody is. So that's a tough situation to. Great point, and I think if there's anything we can do to help, balance that, we should, and we welcome, and we'll take a look at that, and we'll take any advice.
I do appreciate all of the staff's efforts on this, and I'm, all in favor of, improving all of our guidelines, so I don't want any of my comments to be taken as negative, but that, it just struck me there, so I made the observation.
Well, and I'll just, I know Commissioner Warner has a comment here. We did start out with a percentage of trees. Am I not mistaken?
It was a tree density.
Am I dreaming that? Okay, so we started with a tree density, and I think worked our way back into just let's just do points, because there were some sites that, one in particular, I remember, it was a car dealership. They weren't real crazy. They wouldn't be real crazy about lining the street with trees, and you can't see cars. So low-lying shrubs and some vegetation does great there, with more intermittent trees. So yeah, that's kind of where we landed, to try and take into consideration the business that you're landscaping.
If I might just direct you to this slide right here. this is an example of a landscape plan that kind of balances that. Really, I think more than anything, landscaping, especially if we have well-designed buildings, there might be situations where you can't have a well-designed, or when you can't have a building with all those design features. And the design standards are designed to work with that. In that case, you might want to soften the face of the building, like a large storage building or a large stadium or something like that. Here's an example of a tire shop. A lot of tire shops don't look this nice, but this tire shop has a lot of architectural features on it. It has a nice looking monument sign at the corner, and there are concerns about trees hiding signs, but this is an example of the monument sign with the trees. You can read the monument sign because it's below the crown of the trees. There's low shrubs softening or screening partially the parking lot, because parking lots are not necessarily attractive, but also not hiding everything, so you can still see into the site, you can see the building. So it's really, landscaping is really it needs to vary based on the conditions. And this is a good example of it. There's another one.
That's what I was going to mention before, that a good designer will group the trees in different groupings along the facades, and that NTV building was a good example where they pushed everything back off the corner. The intersection, you had a good visibility of the building. And staff has allowed us to do that here in the past, where you group your landscaping. And I was going to ask, are there any spacing requirements on street trees that we have in the current ordinance?
No.
So that's good. That's another reason I was going to bring that up.
And I have my own opinion about this, but, and I'll share it because I can't help myself, but I think in an urban environment, sometimes it's good to have a rhythm of trees where they are evenly spaced, as long as they're not too dense. You have to take into account the species of the tree. This is why it helps to have a qualified landscape architect. We don't require that landscape architects propose landscape plans, because there actually aren't that many landscape architects in Topeka that I know of. So we do accept plans by others, but you know, we work with people, and again, I think it depends on the tree type, the tree species. You can even get different types of varieties. You can have a columnar variety of the same species that allows you to see the building better. And the trees always look different when they are mature rather than when they're new. So with that, I'll move on to tow lots, screening of tow lots and contractor yards. So,
Can I bring up a question?
Yes.
Sorry. Tell me if I'm completely off base with this, but thinking of that plaza that's on Huntoon and Clay, the Westboro area, they don't have any, I guess, easement of going back to have landscaping in front of that area. So do these areas, and I might be completely wrong, but like, would these requirements encourage or discourage property owners from not being close to the street?
The Westboro shopping
Yeah.
mart, all that.
the one at
Like where Julie's, is it?
Huntoon and Oakley.
Julie's.
Huntoon and Oakley. So Huntoon and Oakley, I think that if there was a conflict, Huntoon and Oakley is interesting because I don't think it's zoned. I don't think those buildings are conform to the current zoning setbacks per zoning. So it's a good question. If there was a conflict, I think we would have to work through that.
Yeah.
In almost all of our districts require a building setback. Downtown, certainly we're not going to require someone meet these same kinds of landscape standards in a downtown, on a downtown site.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I know it wasn't on the survey, I don't think so. But I feel like that's a very pleasing aspect for people to park and then walk around that area as if it's like a mini downtown. I know on First Fridays they have a little area, and it's easy for people to get out and walk around and find it very pleasing without there being a lot of landscape up front. So I was just thinking, I don't know if other areas could benefit from doing the same type of building.
What I've seen in downtown areas landscaping is street trees are encouraged. And you have trees that are in the sidewalk, in grates or small planters, and those work well, those function pretty well with the buildings. Sometimes there are conflicts with visibility, but I think those can be overcome. We aren't quite there yet entirely. Now, that's what happened on Kansas Avenue, but in some of our streets, we still have to work with our other departments and partners, and there are utilities in street rights of way. We have franchise agreements with utility providers, and they want to be able to put their utilities in the streets. But I think that can be overcome. Other communities have done that a lot. They've allowed or encouraged street trees.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, if we're being, we don't have a zoning district outside of downtown such as at Westboro that we have a 0 lot line setback like that. But if there was, and that is something we would encourage, it'd have to be through a PUD. But if that was the case, if that type of a project came to us again, came to you, we would work on, we would not say, oh gosh, you need 20 feet of setback here in front of your pedestrian-oriented buildings. We would probably work on alternative compliance, which is probably, as Mike spoke to, the planters and the street trees. It's a fabulous character to try and get, but it doesn't work for everybody. When it does work, though, the landscape code is flexible enough to work around that. Like you said, downtown is not required to have landscaping, those downtown zoning districts. So those are the ones that would, but Washburn and College Hill, the redevelopment area over at 15th and Washburn Lane, Westboro. There's some other ones I can think of, but I don't think we're here to force suburban landscaping standards on an urban type of a setting like that. And that's, now, do you have anything to add to that in terms of assurances, I guess, or is that the flexibility that we have to not require that, or do we have exclude some zoning districts from this?
Well, I think there's a lot of flexibility in the ordinance. Now, we don't want it to be so flexible that no one follows it, and we don't have any credibility in enforcing it. But just like the project we saw earlier tonight, that was a PUD. Yeah. We were fully supportive of reduced setbacks because it made sense in that more urban environment, that more pedestrian-oriented environment, and it made sense also to have more private open space behind the building, and so we didn't try to force more setback than what was appropriate. And we also, on that one, encouraged trees between the sidewalk and the curb. So once you get into the PUD realm, it's customizing the standards to fit that development. Now we're trying to also adopt standards that don't force us into the PUD game every time, and that's where these building design standards come in.
Thanks.
So just quickly on screening. So currently, the way screening applies to tow lots, it currently does not apply to contractor yards, although they have a similar visual impact. They can be unsightly and uncontrolled. But we have a use table that tells you this use is permitted. A use like a tow lot, and I'll just use this for an example. A tow lot is permitted but subject to specific use requirements in the C4 district, which is our heaviest of the C districts. it's permitted without being subject to specific use requirements in the I-1 and I-2 districts. A contractor yard is permitted by right in the C4 and I-1 and I-2 districts, not subject to any screening requirements. And so what we're proposing to do is tweak that a bit. So tow yards, tow lots, currently there's no requirement that they have any screening along rights-of-way in I districts. We have an extraordinary amount of land that's zoned I-1, I-2 that, you know, if you didn't look at a zoning map, you'd be surprised by that. We have a lot of land that's currently used for retail use that's zoned I-1 on South Topeka Boulevard in that area. And that's why this came up, and I'll show you a real example in a minute. And just applying these same standards to contractor yards. So there'd be screening between the use and adjacent residential uses. There'd also be screening, some screening along public street rights of way. And this is an example of a tow lot on 6th Street, East 6th Street. And this is kind of a tow lot that's kind of morphing into more of like a junkyard. There's a kind of a fine line. But that's what this is
Doesn't look very fine to me.
intended to address, is there'd be a screening requirement along that right-of-way. Now, again, this is a zoning code, so it's not like we would go back and say, you need to bring yours up to current code. It's new tow lots and new contractor yards. But this is what this is intended to address. This is actually very close to our, just down the street here. This is a tow lot. Again, this is adjacent to rights of way. It's in an industrial area. Well, I lost my one slide that was on here. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know why it's not on here, but there's a slide of the area. It's at 19th and Van Buren, and we have a proposed tow lot, and across the street from it is a tow lot that's pretty well kept, but the proposed tow lot's already very junky. There's an enforcement action against it. They are coming in to bring it up to code so they can operate in compliance with our codes. And our ordinance does not require any screening of this tow lot. It's adjacent to rights of way. So this is an industrial district. There actually happens to be a residence just down the street, one lot away. There are also offices along the street. And again, you know, zoning regulations are intended to protect property values, to address negative externalities, the negative impacts of these new developments. And currently, in my opinion, we don't have all the standards in place to do that. And these are fairly modest standards. It would require a fence, landscaping, some combination of both that would provide a screen for these tow lots and contractor yards. So that's what's being proposed.
So in that case, fencing is not chain link fencing.
It'd be correct. It would have some kind of, it'd be an opaque fence. You can't see through it. There are different ways to get there. Or you could have a chain link fence with dense landscaping on the inside or outside of it. So that's what we're working on. That's what we have a draft that we're still tweaking, that we'll be bringing forward. If you have any, I'm here if you have any more questions or recommendations.
Are there any other communications to the commission tonight?
Commissioners, just next month, we don't have any zoning cases, so we will be bringing this to you, the building design standards and the landscape updates for public hearing. And we will look at some of the comments you've made tonight and bring any last second changes along. So that will be our only topic. Just to keep you in the loop, the council did approve all the zoning cases that you heard last month, and actually the month before that. Frito-Lay, the dog park did get approved. I don't know if you followed that the whole way through, but it ended up getting approved. There were no changes to it. So that moved forward. And then, is that it? And then, also, I just wanted you to know, the city had, and I'll copy you on this, city did send a letter of support to Shawnee County for their comprehensive plan. That is before the county commissioners, that they had their first meeting on that today. But I'll copy you on that as well. I think you would find that interesting, to say the least. Okay.
All right.
So that's all I have.
If there are no objections, I would move to adjourn.
No objection.
Hearing none.